Hi, hope I can be heard. Just a quick shout out, given this is the semifinals, and who knows if we're going to advance through here. But shout out to my partner, first tournament debating, they're doing pretty well, and also fun to see some friendly faces down the bench for their own. Sorry, Alex, you're going to have a field day in econ. I can feel this. Cool. So we POIs in the chat, please. If I haven't taken you by 5:30, please unmute yourselves. I'm going to try to take, the long diagonal, sort of interact with you guys. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, 3 things that we're going to run from OG. Firstly, why we think that the pegged currency to the West is bad and why it prevents these countries from conducting their own independent monetary policy. Secondly, why we think a lot of these African states are literally not the same and it doesn't make sense for them to follow the same currency. And thirdly, why we have a problem with the French. I know SPU is French, but none of us is French on the team. Just a quick announcement, right? First, before that, on the model, I think that obviously we're gonna have a gradual adoption where you're kind of targeting your new currency to somewhat be pegged to another currency, but after a while, just to avoid any sort of attacks in your currency in the first week of it and introducing it, right? You're just gonna peg it to something else, but gradually you're gonna start conducting your own monetary policy. Secondly, you're probably gonna do some sort of managed float to have it as a benchmark against, I don't know, the dollar or something, right? So that you avoid some in essential volatility because of trade or some commodity shocks, etc., etc. This is something that already all the European countries do, whatever. First argument, why we think that peg currencies and why pegging to euro is uniquely bad. I have 3 reasons here. First and foremost, right? I think that it is very important for these states to conduct their own monetary policy. Why is this so? If you're pegging your currency to another currency, such as the euro, it means that you want to peg it so that it's on the same business cycle. Note that Africa and Europe are literally 2 separate continents and their economies are not that intertwined, right? In the European Union, you have the euro because those are mostly advanced service-based economies that are not that much reliant on the agriculture, right? That are not much reliant on other things within their economies, right? African states, on the other hand, are very, very different, right? They're still probably reliant on some very huge global shocks, but it's very untrue that the German worker or the German domestic industry output has anything to do with the agricultural output of these countries, right? Or how much commodities these countries extract and what are the prices that they get. Meaning that probably you're going to have inflation cycles or the business cycle and how your economy is growing to be very, very different from those of the European countries. What does this mean? If there's a recession in Europe, it means that there might not be a recession in the African states. In turn, it means that the monetary policies, i.e., that the interest rate that the central banks set, are going to be rather different of what these countries want to do, right? How are interest rates related to currency values? It is because if you have a higher interest rate of the monetary policy, then investors are going to come in try to buy that currency more because there's a higher return on your investment, right? If you buy the hard currency of that country, they have higher interest rates, etc., etc. But if you're pegged to the euro, you're most likely also be linked to the interest rate that European countries or i.e. France is going to set, not France, but ECB in Europe, right? The central bank. This means that you might end up in many situations where the interest rate, for example, in Europe is high, but you have a low interest rate. But even if you have low interest rate, right, you might go into inflationary spirals, whereas Europe is managing its monetary policy pretty well, right? So you might end up in instances where there's simply a policy mismatch between Europe and your own country. The second reason is that we think that if you do an independent monetary policy as in your country, by creating these institutions and we assume that there's some fiat of this happening, right? I think it's good to have a central bank that also gets have a say over how the economy essentially is run in that country. This is seen as the independent central banks has a monitoring or a moderating effect on the things that governments do, right? If governments make some stupid decisions, the central banks can still I don't know, cut interest rates in times of recession and actually help individuals to get cheaper loans, right, and stimulate the economy. If sometimes you might get a politician in power that is not able to do so, whereas on their side of the house, they're probably left with politicians only scrambling to do fiscal stimulus in times of economic crisis because they literally have no control over monetary policy. So they tend to overcompensate. They tend to invest in the wrong things as opposed to banks issuing loans in your own currency and like investors and individuals being able to make independent like economic policy decisions and invest where they want. Before I move on to the two other things I wanted to talk about, I'm actually going to take CO.
Yeah, so how similar are these countries? And if the countries are good enough to control their own currency, why are they not also good enough governments to control their own fiscal policy?
Okay, so the monetary policy, the last point that I meant was like even if, right? Like monetary, like independent monetary policy just like gives you one more check, even if you're doing a decent fiscal stimulus or whatever, this gives you additional benefit. But now the second argument that I'm going to run is literally why these countries are not the same. I think like two or maybe three main reasons. First, like notice like literally if you read the news or if you've read anything about the region, these countries are like literally not the same. For example, Senegal is relatively a democracy, right? They have had changes of government, whereas like Niger and Mali are literally like military, like have had military coups, right? This means that like investors from the West or like other places are now like basically kept from investing in these countries or doing business or trade with these countries because they treat them literally the same, right? Because they're going to have the same effect of policy because they have like literally the same like sort of economic system depend on the same currency, right? Therefore, it's very, very bad that like if one of these states, sorry, but like fucks up and there's like a civil war breaking out, right? Or like if there's a bad government elected in one of them, all of the rest like lose out on investment. I think this is simply unfair. And like even if they do like separate currencies, like, you know, by themselves, that they're at least in some instances, they're going to do decent economic policy as well, right? Secondly, they also have like probably like pretty different economies as well. Like some of these economies are more dependent on the natural resource extraction of like extracting like minerals or like metals or like oil, right? Versus others are like more agricultural based. Some have like more sprawling like service industries if you're like around the coast, right? So it's just like very, very different economic policies and things that they want to pursue, which means that also the business cycles might be different sometimes in the region, right? So therefore, we probably might likely to attract more investors because they don't see these countries as like all failing, but at least some of them are going to be success stories that are going to attract more investment. Thirdly, a little bit about like the French and why we don't like them. Three reasons, or maybe two, we'll see. First, we kind of like benefit the French like neo-colonial power in the region, right? Because if you French is like literally keeping a significant portion, as the info slide says, of your like treasury and your hard currency, you probably are incentivized to trade with the French exclusively, right? Because that is how you obtain your hard currency back, meaning that like you literally have no choice, right? Under our side of the house, at least you can, I don't know, trade in dollars because like that's the biggest currency for trade, and you can like more relatively get better prices maybe on the market, right? So therefore benefiting your economy more, or also you're not like dependent on the political whims of the French who might coerce you into trading certain different goods that they just want their goods to be marketed on, right? Because of all these reasons, proud to stand on government.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to open the debate inside opposition, we call the leader of UP. Here.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Sick, thank you. I would prefer PY's audible if possible, but also have chat open, just in case. Okay. I feel like I have a lot to get to in this speech, so I'm just going to start out very quickly on refutation to what we just heard from opening government. There are three things that they basically tell you. The first is that states should conduct their own monetary policy and have the ability to be independent. There are three responses to this. The first is that like it's probably not realistic to say that their policies are going to be one-to-one to Europe or to France or to any individual country, regardless, or even the EU. But second, the trilemma of international finance says that you can do 2 out of 3 things, but you cannot do all 3, right? The 3 are pegging an exchange rate, independent monetary policy, and free financial flows. To the extent that the only thing that is guaranteed in the shared currency is the pegging of exchange rate, it's incredibly unlikely that they're not going to be able to like have some degree of independence with their monetary policy, which means that each individual, or like that this the group of shared currencies and the countries generally probably have the ability to differentiate themselves from the EU, from EU policy, and like, you know, the euro generally. this, and also like the third response is that like regardless, even if this is all true, it's probably better to have the stability which this shared currency offers in terms of investment, which I'll get into later. The second thing they then tell you is like that these countries are not all the same. First, I think there's no golden rule that says that shared currency countries have to be identical or even largely similar, right? Like the EU works because, or like the euro works because not all of the countries in it are the same. And the second is that the fact that they are not the same is actually probably much better than if they all were identical, insofar as that if one country is struggling, whether that be like through a military coup or just some economic hardship, the others have an incentive to help them out. And even further, if the others within Africa don't have an incentive, the EU and European states do have an incentive to help them out because they are tied to their policy, to their euro, probably likely that they're trading a lot with them. The third thing that they then tell you is like why the French are bad. To be clear, like I think they're probably trading with the EU and not with France specifically, but like, you know, would be nice to hear more about this. Second, now I want to talk first about our main point about why joint currency is probably better. There are 3 points under this. The first is about why regional trade is much better and why that happens almost exclusively or like much better on our side of the house. The first reason is because there's no added cost when you're exchanging currency. On the comparative, if each of these individual states were to have their individual currency, it's likely that you would incur costs when you're exchanging currency. That is incredibly bad for 2 reasons. The first is that regional trade is a great source of revenue for individuals who like trade across borders. Likely comes down to like people who live in border towns or who like, you know, need to access a port from one of the Western countries. The geographic proximity makes it very easy for regional trade to not only exist on our side of the house, but also to flourish on our side of the house because you don't incur the costs that could otherwise hinder an individual from looking towards regional trade. The second reason is that you have a constant revenue stream that just exists on our side of the house because A, regional trade is much more stable, which is to say that because you have geographical proximity, it is probably likely that if one country faces something, for example, like a natural disaster or something like that, the other countries around them can help out, but also because you just like are closer, it's cheaper to trade goods, things of that nature. Also, it's just much more predictable. Like the value of a government budget isn't unpredictably changing because it's likely that the euro itself is something that is like relatively stable. This stability, and which is the second reason why joint currency is good, increases investor confidence. And I think that there are 2 ways that this happens. The first is generally through company investment, which is to say that even in in our best case scenario, it's likely that investors are going to want to invest in stable currencies. And if it's tied to the euro, likely that it's stable. But B, even in our worst case scenario, as OG points out, in like the case that one of the countries has a military coup, it's much more likely that somebody is going to want to invest in the joint currency rather than just investing in the country that didn't have the military coup and leaving them out to dry and not improving their quality of life and their economic development. The second thing under this is about country investment, because I think you also get a lot more FDI, not only from Europe, but like probably generally, because if Europe is in there, then probably other countries are in there also trying to compete, giving them the best deals possible in order to increase their development. The third and final point under this is that I think it's just really easy to like send back remittances when you're in this area, which means that if there is migration in between countries that have this shared currency, it's likely that you are like your family is much better off insofar as that you don't like have the costs that are associated with the exchange, like exchanging between these individual countries and also currencies, and also means that like you're more likely to just be able to get more money across the border back to your own country and own community. Before I continue, I'll take closing.
So a part of keeping a currency pegged means your interest rates have to follow the Eurozone interest rates. It also means you have to use all of your foreign reserves to keep the peg. That's why independence doesn't work in your world.
Sure. The first thing I want to say is like, you definitely do not use all of your reserves, you use a significant fraction, but I think that that is like an important difference. But the second thing is that I'm not saying that like you have full independence. Obviously, that would be an incredibly stupid argument. What I'm saying is that you have some degree of independence, and I think that the like impact that OG brings is incredibly overblown. The second point then is about why independent currencies are bad. The first point under this is that you're contingent on the amount of foreign reserves that you have. The strength is also contingent on how many people hold this currency within your own country. You have independent currencies and what their trust levels of it are. People who like most money in these countries in the status quo, probably wealthy elites, probably also true on the other side. People won't trust the government on their side of the house if they develop all of a sudden like individual currencies, right? It's a large shift. So it's likely that they don't buy the individual currency in the degree of mass that they buy the shared currency now, because they know that it's not pegged to the euro. They know that there's not as much stability to it. The comparative is that on-side government, each country has their own currency, but it's incredibly weak because people don't trust in it. They don't buy these large amounts of reserves because it's like they don't see the stability. The second reason why independent currencies are bad is because of Dutch disease. I think that, which means that when one sector of a country is super strong, but the rest become like much weaker to it. This is incredibly bad for currency because it appreciates it superficially, but the superficial appreciation is not sustainable in the long run. For example, if Cameroon's oil sector is super profitable right now, the appreciation of their individual currency, if it did exist, would be not sustainable in the long run, which means that even if you have investor confidence now, it's unlikely that you will continue that because they know that your country is suffering from Dutch disease. The third is that it's dependent upon individual factors, the first being like political stability. I think OG is right to point out that there's some instability in the status quo. A lot of West African countries have been experiencing coups or strengthening militaries, for example, like Niger and Burkina Faso. Not only is this very bad for the state of the economy because the trust in government decreases, it's also bad for investor confidence. And lastly, on seasonal fruitfulness, like if your country is mainly based on agriculture, probably depends on that instability. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now, to further the case of opening government, I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, everybody. Thank you guys for judging this round. Really appreciate it. Glad to have Chris by my side. For POIs, can I please ask for a favor and have them in the chat and also with the raise hand function? It just helps me see and make sure that I catch it. I'm probably going to take also from closing side, but opening side, if you have one, also be the same. I'll be starting then in 3, 2, 1. Okay, what we're going to be doing in this debate is we're going to be moving really, really carefully and slowly through a lot of these issues, because honestly, although like they split up the case on the opposition side, a lot of it is really revolved around a central point. So what they're talking about, the first thing that they bring up really substantially is a trilemma. And there we have fixed exchange rates, independent monetary policies, and free flowing of goods and capital. The problem with this is that they say, okay, well, we want the fixed exchange rate, and we have independent monetary policies to some degree, and we're not too worried about the regulation of capital outflows. We're just saying, why don't we have free capital outflows and inflows, which encourages investor confidence, and have independent monetary policy, which helps countries regulate based on their specific needs regarding investment and building up domestic industries through investment and through like taking out of loans and stuff like that. Because the problem here is that we're worried about a situation in which countries like Senegal, where we know that there's a relative amount of stability, Cameroon, where the example that was given, have industries that need investment. Cameroon, for example, had the cardiopad, which helped get really, really important medical technology to different hospitals in the area. The reason that they were able to do this was because of investor confidence in Cameroon. However, we could have so much more investment if we were to say, look, this country is isolated, has its own independent currency, irrespective of what happens in Mali and West Africa. Because right now, the fact is, we cannot trust what's happening in these countries. There have been 2 coups in Mali, right? I think it's Mali. Maybe it was Niger. I'm so sorry if I'm getting that wrong. But one of the countries had 2 coups. The other one had 1, which is still pretty bad, right? The implication here is that there is an instability there. They say that joint will make it safer and encourage investor confidence. This doesn't make sense. If I know that there's one party, one bad apple spoils the barrel here, we need a uniformity within areas where people can invest. If we can encourage investor confidence to encourage investment in, for example, Senegal, we can boost that country's people in a significantly more valid way. They say, well, we don't want industry to do too well because then Dutch disease. By this logic, we can never access any sort of economic benefit. The fear that one country may be able to have wealth and actually grow as a country, maybe they won't become a high income country, but like Netherlands ended up pretty all right with Dutch disease. Like it's not the best situation. It prevents like long-term economic growth, but it is definitely helpful and better than the current situation where there's just a dearth of funding and an inability for the government to finance any sort of expenditure. Because the major problem that occurs is when governments aren't able to finance the projects that they need to. The fact of the matter is, let's say France goes into recession, Europe as a whole goes into recession. They have a very aligned business cycle. The characterization that it doesn't matter if your business cycles aren't aligned is completely false. Let's say the business cycles aren't aligned. Europe is in recession. Should they be in a recession, they are going to respond to that recession by decreasing the interest rates. They are going to give very, very low interest rates. This makes a lot of the financing efforts that the Central African and Western African countries that are trying to, encourage investment by having higher rates of interest and that encourage investment in the like bonds and treasury bonds that are being given out by these countries over American bonds. Like they have no bargaining power because they are known to be slightly riskier than the most safe bonds on the market, which are American treasury bonds. And so there's no incentive for the average investor to invest in West African and Central African bonds, meaning that they have no capacity to finance any government projects. They have no capacity to say, look, we know this industry has a capacity to grow. It's not attracting enough Western investors. Therefore, we're going to put money into this. We're going to help support this. Zero potential on that side of the house. And so what we also say is like, look, they're saying that there's regional trade and things like that. And the problem with the regional trade is that it's just outweighed significantly if you compare that to the type of trade potential that we would have by engaging with our Western allies in the United States, encouraging greater investment from them because we're able to bargain outside of this sort of restrictive relationship and binary with France and the Western Europe. Because we're able to engage with China, which is increasingly important, especially as China is focusing more on its African policy and economic integration through its Belt and Road Initiative. We can also focus on trading with other developing countries in, for example, South America. We can focus on looking at what's happening in the United States and Canada. We can attract greater numbers of investors and force the Europeans into a competitive paradigm that we're not otherwise able to do so. Can I please get a POI from closing?
Yeah, so all of this is contingent on the idea that like if you have different industries, the ones that are much better will not just outcompete the ones that are much worse. You won't have just like bigger countries like manipulating their currency to damage smaller ones. Why does that not just happen?
I mean, so bigger countries like fighting in terms of currency wars, like the truth is that like we don't expect any of these countries to be such a massive threat in terms of like actual economic struggle that they're like China's going to enter a currency cutting war with it. Like that's just like not a reasonable presupposition, at least in the short medium term. Like maybe long term, we start getting worried that China's going to start like aggressively manipulating like their currencies in order to get into like a trade war competition with like I don't know, freaking Cameroon, maybe like I just don't see that happening in the short medium term. That's not a reasonable threat that I would be worried about. More significantly, though, like we can experience that on our side of the house actually better because like we can aggressively start like cutting the value of our currency in such a way that enables us to increase like the price like the value of our exports significantly and encourage nascent industries domestically. So like we actually have more flexibility on our side of the house in order to like do the opposite but from our angle. So like I think that it's just at the very minimum a wash, but otherwise in our favor because it's just unlikely and characteristic. Now I want to also just like look at some of the other points that we brought up and kind of just explain their impacts because I think that if we effectively impact our side of the house, they are the number one reasons you should be voting for us in this round. First, I want to look at, for example, the fact that we say that you have countries like the French is a neo-colonial power that keeps the reserves and we have limited trading partners. With a limited trading partner like France and the rest of Western Europe, we are unable to create effective deals with various investors who are already disinclined to vote to give investments into Western African countries and Central African countries. They are simply not going to trade with us if we have to do it in the euro, if we have to do it in a, and France will react negatively if we were to threaten our exclusive relationship with them via the maintenance of our monetary reserves. It's simply a lot more difficult for us to get out of this sort of constricted relationship. France has additionally entered sorts of culture wars with Western African countries, and they're not a reliable trading partner or investing partner right now. For example, most recently, France cut off their willingness to support West African artists because of the coups in Mali and Niger. They're just saying like, look, we don't trust you guys anymore. There's a breakdown of trust. And how can we deal with a breakdown of trust in this situation when it has such large potential ramifications when all of our reserves are with those countries? Take, for example, like the idea that what if France was to try and punish a lot of the economic policies happening in Western Africa by like acting on their central reserves or refuse to issue it to the new government in power because they don't recognize it as legitimate. There's all sorts of like major issues at play here, which could affect the long-term stability of those countries and also affect their overall well-being. Therefore, for all these reasons, we ask that you affirm government side and opening up. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate in the opening half, I call upon the deputy leader of the opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, sure.
Okay, wonderful. Wait, please make POIs audibly. If you could like wave, that would be amazing. But I'll call it out anyway. Oh, and before that, I want to thank Genevieve, your wonderful partner. I love you with my whole heart, and also just Princeton in general, the team for being so supportive and lovely always, and for the opportunity to debate in semis. Okay, no, I'll start. Sorry. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. I think it's quite crazy that government only spends like 10 seconds talking about the transition period. The CFA was ratified during the Bretton Woods Agreement in like the mid-20th century. And now suddenly an entire region is going to have independent currencies. We think that this will actually look like is that the wealthy elites who hold the majority of wealth in these countries will not just like accept that this is the new currency, but will rather just buy francs and dollars, which means that these currencies will very much struggle to acquire the comparative value that they have right now when like they're actually pegged to like the franc or to the euro. Furthermore, we think that it is unlikely that foreign investors will just wait and see if the currency eventually becomes stable after the transition period while keeping their business in an incredibly vulnerable position. This is particularly true when we understand that there's massive competition between developing countries to attract foreign direct investment because their main comparative advantage is cheap labor. So companies can just leave West Africa and go to a different region such as like Southeast Asia. We think that this is worse in the context that Genevieve was talking about, which is the fact that 6 countries from the western to like the eastern coast of Africa have witnessed military coups in the last 2 years, which means that there's already skepticism in regards to like the degree to which these countries are stable enough for them to have foreign direct investment. To that extent, we believe that this will actually lead to catastrophic economic consequences for these countries, and this is something that we don't support. I want to deal with their point on colonialism first, because I think it's not that strong. First of all, I think because of incentives of reparations, there's and like ties between political figures, this will probably not be a tipping point in regards to like post-colonial influence between France and like Western Africa, but just in general between like Europe and the region. And the reason for this is they continue to pour like a significant amount of foreign aid towards the region and have like a lot of like French firm presence and investment there anyway. So it's unclear like why this makes a significant difference and like makes neocolonialism a lot worse. There's also just a lot of migration between Western African countries and former colonies, and also like their foreign reserves will probably still stay in the French treasury because of security concerns of like transferring the reserves back. So we don't see like they don't really prove a delta in this regard. Now, an important clarification is I think a pegged exchange rate leads to less inflation in the first place. And I think this circumvents a lot of the impacts that they try to bring in opening government. And the reason why this is the case is first, it encourages governments to be better about their economic policies in the first place, because they're afraid that their economy is going to come to a point where they necessarily have to remove the peg against this currency, because that would be just like massively politically unpopular. People would be very afraid of this huge economic shift and what this is going to do to like the value of their money and the value of their savings. But secondly, I think people are just more willing to hold domestic currency when there's like the security that this currency has been strong for the past like 50 years. To that extent, I believe in the majority of cases, we probably evade the issue of inflation when you maintain this currency peg on our side of the house. But now, I think it is true that there are instances where like countries should probably change their monetary policy, and they can't really do that on our side of the house. But I think that there are like alternative ways to tackle economic issues that don't involve appreciating or depreciating your currency. For example, you can just change the reserve requirements of banks if you're having like inflationary spirals. But even if that's not the case, and like taking opening government at their best, I think it is preferable to not mess with the value of your currency, even if it does mean having some degree of inflation. This is where the weighing comes in. Many reasons why currency stability is actually essential during times of economic crisis, but something that's just generally beneficial for these countries. The first is what Genevieve was telling you of how you have greater foreign capital security. 2 reasons for this. You have a greater certainty that there's a stable domestic market for goods, i.e. you know that people's purchasing power is going to stay relatively stable, and to that extent, you know that there's people who are going to purchase your goods. But secondly, you know that people won't start migrating massively because the economics are relatively stable, and therefore you have a guaranteed labor force, which is what determines your comparative advantage as a firm that is outsourcing labor in Africa. To that extent, we believe that currency stability is actually super, super important for foreign direct investment. But why like should you actually care about foreign capital? First, they're just massive sources of employment in the region. Taxation is hard because of like scarce population across like vast territories. It is difficult for these governments to like have the infrastructure to be able to gain revenue through taxation, and therefore they can't offer unemployment benefits. They can't invest in meaningful job creation. So these companies are like crucial for there to not be a super high rate of unemployment. But secondly, they're just drivers of development. This is something that we know, right? They drive infrastructural development. They provide technology and know-how that leads to long-term increases in productivity and allow economies to transition from like agricultural heavy to manufacturing heavy economies. They're just like super, super important. In the comparative, these countries like will face investor flight in the short term, which is like really, really bad, right? But they will still try to attract investment, but do so in worse ways, in ways such as like massively increasing interest rates so that it's still worthwhile for these companies to go to these countries, which means that the poorest of people living in these countries cannot take loans, cannot feed their family. That's a really big impact. But it also means like giving more land and labor concessions to these companies, increasing their comparative political power within the country. We think that this is overall a lot worse. Second reason why you should really care about currency stability is because on our side of the house, supply chains actually remain affordable within regional trade. What this means is I, as a country in Western Africa, can still purchase grain from a neighboring country to feed my population because the exchange rate is the exact same. Versus on the comparative, you could have a period of sudden hyperinflation, like it is the case in Zimbabwe, or it was like at the beginning of the 21st century, and then your government budget suddenly is worth a lot less, so you can no longer import as much as you were doing so, and it can have huge ramifications as in literally I can no longer like feed my population. This matters a lot because I believe that there's just a high share of trade within this area because of like historical reasons. But third and very importantly, I think you protect the weakest of countries on our side of the house, which is an issue that they also try to win on site opening government. They talk about the idea of like, what if there's a coup and then there's decreased trust in the whole currency and like the whole region is fucked? I don't think that this is true, right? You're pegged to an extremely strong currency. This is analogous to like people didn't just stop using the euro when Greece was in crisis. Sure, they were like a little bit scared, but it's still a very strong currency that people like in general trust. Yeah, I'll take a POI now.
Right. So if I am an FDI firm or an MNC and I go to a country where I risk political coups, why is an unpegged currency the tipping point suddenly?
I think it is a tipping point because it can like meaningfully affect your revenue stream, right? In the moment when a country can no longer import a like good that is a factor in the good that you're producing, then it is impossible for you to maintain the same level of profit. In the moment when there's like a huge crisis to the extent where your workers can no longer show up because they're migrating to a different country, then it is a huge issue for you. We believe that these economic crises are a lot more likely on your side of the house. Governments are less able to like deal with them, and that is why all of these issues like continue to accrue. Now, on weighing, I believe that on our side of the house, we actually target the most vulnerable stakeholders in the sense that like the comparatively less strong economies are protected on our side of the house. These are the countries with like the highest unemployment rate, the highest security concerns. These are the people that you should vote on and give us the ballot on. I think that on our side of the house, the delta is that you encourage interregional cooperation out of a like national incentive to just like want to maintain your economic strength, i.e., for example, providing a loan to a neighboring country or like new trade deals in order for them to stay afloat in the moment when they're struggling. We believe that this is really, really good. I think on weighing, it is possible that a lack of monetary independence leads to one country's like economy deteriorating, but on our side, it's also a lot easier for people to migrate and to send money home. We believe that that is a comparative advantage, and we're very, very proud to be an op.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to open the debate in the closing half, I call upon the member of government here.
All right, POIs in the chat, please. And I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 pieces of extension, all of which are kind of linked. One extension, whatever. First thing, why will the institutions, that is to say the newly created central banks, be created well and are likely to be independent? Because all of OG is premised on this, and they never show why this will be created well, right? They just say, motion assumes so. No, it doesn't. Firstly, incentives. 3 reasons or 4 incentives. Firstly, if you don't develop an independent central bank after this happens, because you currently don't have one, because you can't have control over your monetary policy. So you want to get more business, right? You probably want to attract all the FDI that OO is talking about. So you have an incentive to make it independent and made it well such that you can still have access to this business. The more OO weaponizes their own FDI point, the better this incentive. Secondly, you want to have things like access to global clout, right? You want to be respected by other countries as a country that is actually meaningfully trying to improve its future, which is especially relevant to those African countries because they constantly ask for aid because they have many, many problems that they need this for. And if you lose this international clout, it's much difficult for you to be able to ask for this. Thirdly, because very likely the World Bank and the IMF will partake in this. Why? Because 3 African countries have already did this. So Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia already decoupled like this. The IMF and the World Bank consulted there, and they're likely to consult here as well. That means that those institutions also shape other parts of your development, right? You need loans from them, like in crisis situations or for development. So you're likely to comply with what they're telling to you, and therefore you have an incentive to make sure to do this well. Lastly and fourthly, I would say many people are People in the government of those countries are afraid of things like elite capture. So setting up an independent institution is a good way to bypass this. Why are you capable of doing this? Two reasons, super simple. One, it already happened, which means it is possible, but also there were some lessons to be learned when it happened the first time with the 3 other countries, and you can apply those and make sure that it happens better. And secondly, you incorporate the World Bank and the IMF. They have the expertise in this. They literally have like people that are like the most economically educated in the world, and they're able to set this up well. Second, then, important piece of framing, because CEO challenges OG very correctly. Why is fiscal policy not enough to do all the kind of business cycle adjustments that you talk about? OG doesn't answer. 3 reasons for why fiscal policy isn't enough. Firstly, because fiscal policy is not independent. You're susceptible to things like political cycles, perverse short-termist incentives, appeasing the electorate, even if this hurts the economy in the long term, which means that it doesn't always do the best things that people want, which is why we had independent central banks created in the first place, right? Secondly, because those countries are already quite heavily indebted, because they had to borrow a shit ton of money to be able to survive COVID because they didn't get the same vaccine rollouts that other countries got, which means, especially in the current high interest rate climate globally, that it's difficult for them to be able to borrow to help their economies even more currently. And their credit ratings are pretty bad as well, which means that like oftentimes they just need to like borrow to like literally repay the interest that they currently have now. So they're in no position to have the freedom to be able to actually orchestrate good economic conditions for their country. Thirdly, though, fiscal policy is strengthened with an independent monetary policy. Why? 2 reasons. A, because you can literally like borrow or lend money to the state as a central bank. The Federal Reserve buys US bonds all the time by printing money. And this also gives more stability to your own fiscal policy, because then you know that the central bank is there as a lender of last resort. And therefore your own fiscal policy can flourish more because there's less perceived risk when you are lending money to those countries. 2, though, worst case, even if you're over indebted, the central bank can inflate your debt away. So by lowering interest rates and increasing money supply, it can increase the price levels in the economy, which oftentimes also put wage pressures up, which means that from taxes like VAT and income tax, you get more money and your debt is relatively lower. And even if the worst comes to shove, you can always then inflate your debt away like that. Why can you not do this with a pegged currency, right? Because as I gave in the POI, a pegged currency isn't some magical concept that your currency is like pegged to the euro perfectly. No, it means you just intervene in free markets to keep it within some range, right? That means whenever the ECB changes interest rates, you need to change interest rates. That means whenever the ECB or whenever the euro fluctuates in any way, you need to use all of your foreign reserves to be able to get it back to the original level, right? So that means you can't do anything with rates, you can't print money, you can't use your own reserves. Why is it that important to have access to this? And I think here OG kind of lacks, right? Because they don't really impact why things are bad. So for example, if your economy is stagnating and you are in deflation and your prices are decreasing, that can put you in a very, very bad cycle, because when people expect prices to decrease, they postpone purchases, which leads to less demand. Less demand means you need less people to produce the stuff. So you fire more people, they have less money, so they buy less stuff, and you have less demand and more deflation. A deflationary spiral is really, really fucking scary and something that you need immediate monetary policy interventions to get out of. An example is Czechia used their own monetary policy to get out of that in 24. But also, the reverse happens with inflation, and inflation is oftentimes self-perpetuating because people expect prices to rise, so they buy stuff now, but then that increases demand, right? The illustration here is that one country that exports a natural resource could see the price of the resource rise, so they get a lot more revenue, and they strengthen domestic demand, and they have inflation issues. Whereas another country, which maybe doesn't and has different struggles with their own industry, is suffering through deflation. But you can't be able to affect that because you don't have access to monetary policy. And the only thing you can resort to is fiscal policy, which I have already shown doesn't work that well. Go ahead.
Even if you create a strong central bank structure, the value of your currency depends on how many people conduct transactions with it. Why will there be blanket trust when citizens already have a negative view of their governments?
There will be trust because you now have control over things that you didn't control. I'll explain when I finish the argument. Why is it then likely that the economies of different African nations are not likely to be in sync, and why each of them needs their own currency, right? 4 reasons. A, many export natural resources, many don't, which means some global commodity shocks, some aren't. 2, even if a lot export natural resources, they export different ones, which means that different ones are affected by different shocks, right? So like a lithium exporter is different from no export. Thirdly, they're asymmetrically impacted by climate change. So West African states have a lot of issue with massive crop yields being just like burnt away, or like with like droughts and not being able to use. And fourthly, there's different exposure to foreign export markets. So Central African landlocked states trade a lot less, so they're more susceptible to global market volatility, whereas no, less, so they're less susceptible, and West African states are more, which means that their economies fluctuate in asymmetrical ways. That means that having an independent monetary policy is the catalyst to this. And now this co-opts OO, because when you're finally able to have control over your own economic conditions, that's when you're more stable. That's when there's less risk. And that's where you can get all of the stuff that OO talks about. Very proud.
Thank you very much. I just want to make sure we stop recording before we call on the member of UP.